So Plaza Accord की आपने बात की. So what exactly happened in that 1980s period of Plaza Accord? And आप जो बोल रहे हो अभी वापस same
Some version of that.
हाँ,
Maybe
version
not
of that.
same.
क्या होता
So
है?
1985, what happened was, as I was saying, I told you earlier, Paul Volcker became, I think, the Fed chair in 1979 or so. Just like current times, the last 3-4 years in the US, and especially after Ronald Reagan became the president in January 1981, while Paul Volcker was increasing interest rates to basically kill inflation, Ronald Reagan was increasing fiscal deficits because he had promised tax cuts. He did tax cuts. And he had promised national security defense expenditures to go up because he wanted to take on the Soviet Union and finally crush it or whatever, have those Star Wars, those anti-ballistic missiles, space wars, etc. Long story short, he spent money on tax cuts and defense, expanded the fiscal deficit while the monetary tightening happened. Interest rates were increased. It's very similar to what happened in last 4-5 years in the US.
Just to explain, so fiscal deficit is basically how much money the government is spending minus the total income which the government is
higher
getting.
fiscal deficit means they're spending more compared to the taxes they're taking in. So the gap between spending of the government minus the revenue of the government, if it's higher, that means fiscal deficit is higher.
Okay.
Okay. So America in the early 80s, money was tight, basically interest rates was high, and fiscal deficit was becoming higher. That is generally a recipe for dollar to strengthen. Why? Because interest rate high means people are thinking कि यार हमारे country में 10% मिल रहा है उधर 15% मिल रहा है. Let's send there. Fiscal expansion generally keeps the economy strong in the short term at least. So there is no recession, there is no contraction, there is activity happening. And because the dollar is not getting weaker, then people will say 15% मिल रहा है, 10% मिल रहा है, and कोई currency का downside नहीं है. So then that cycle builds on itself. Very something similar happened in the last 5 years in America also, but we'll come to that. So the dollar became very strong from say 1978 to 1984 end. And this is the time when a lot of West German, because Germany was not united then, East Germany, West Germany का unification बाद में हुआ था after the Soviet Union fell. West Germany की currency थी Deutschmark, उस समय euro नहीं था. Japan obviously was there, उसका currency yen ही था. A lot of German and Japanese cars. I mean, this deal was with Canada, France, UK also, but it's primarily with West Germany and Japan with the US. And it happened at a hotel in Manhattan called Plaza Hotel, which, by the way, later on was owned by Donald Trump. I think it also went bankrupt at some point. And Home Alone 2 की shooting इधर हुई थी in Plaza Hotel. And उसमें there is a scene in which Donald Trump is there in the background. I don't know if you remember that. So Kevin or whoever that actor was as a child actor, there was a Donald Trump scene behind. So just a historical tidbit, but basically Ronald Reagan was the president then. He met the German and Japanese, his people met the German and Japanese people. He told them that आप अपनी करेंसी को अप्रिशिएट करिए, डॉइचमार्क और येन को, जो आज के दिन बिहाइंड द सीन्स वो चाइना को बोल रहे हैं. क्यों? क्योंकि आप बहुत गाड़ियां, यू आर एक्सपोर्टिंग टू मेनी कार्स टू द यूएस. If you don't do that, we will put voluntary export restraints, is what they call it, VER, which is basically a fancy way of saying tariffs. We will basically not buy as many of cars. या तो आप अपनी currency appreciate कर लो, नहीं तो हम कुछ कर लेंगे. So they made a deal. The deal was actually not as strong as it ended up becoming for especially Japan. Japan की currency बहुत ज़्यादा appreciate करी उसके बाद, which partially led to the Japanese bubble and then later crash. One of the reasons why China does not like the word Plaza Accord, because it is seen as forcing Japan to become temporarily financially rich but long-term economically defanged. It is a connotation of the accord कि उस accord में उन्होंने जबरदस्ती जापान को एक बार तो अमीर कर दिया. At one point, just the Tokyo Palace was more expensive than all of California put together. At one point, the Japanese stock market was more valuable than the US stock market, and the Japanese GDP almost caught up with the US.
Wow.
Because the yen appreciated massively. But long term, because Japanese exports became uncompetitive, etc., other reasons, Japan ka long term slowdown ho gaya. Partially because of this, although there were other reasons like demographics, etc., debt, all of that. So what happened in Plaza Accord is 1985 mein dollar ka peak ho gaya, then dollar came down. As I said, 1995 was the next bottom, फिर भरा 2002 तक. The Plaza Accord was Americans basically forcing or arm twisting the Japanese and the Germans to appreciate the Deutschmark and the yen against the US dollar. The US dollar effectively came down, and the US dollar came down, and they were happy because they had to import less from other countries. And after that, by the way, German and especially Japanese car makers started making plants in America. The Japanese especially went to southern parts of the US, जहाँ पे union बाजी कम था थोड़ा सा, and then that continued. So now, what people are talking 40 years later, see, of course, it cannot be the same thing because Japan and Germany were dependent on America for security against the Soviet Union. जबकि अमेरिका का तो एक्चुअल जियोपॉलिटिकल फोर चाइना ही है. So China, US does not have the same kind of leverage on China as it did on West Germany and Japan. West Germany and Japan, they could simply say, like, listen, you literally are covered by my nuclear umbrella. You kind of have to listen to me, right? They were allies, but they were in a way subservient to the US, you can say it. I mean, without being too disrespectful, I think it's fair to say that. The Chinese, of course, are under no such geopolitical or military pressure. If at all, they are actually a threat or a competitor to America, right? So using the geopolitical or security card will not work with the Chinese. And they may not write anything, they may not be seen as losing face. But the Chinese are exporting much more to America than they are importing from America. And more importantly, as I was saying, Americans may disagree with Europeans and Indians on many things. Everybody thinks that China का कुछ ज़्यादा export हो गया. So the Chinese are under pressure. See, Sun Tzu had a famous saying, appear strong when you are weak and appear weak when you are strong. So it's not, the Chinese are playing it very tough right now with Donald Trump. They're not even, as I said, picking up the phone and talking with him. That does not mean that they're not in a bad situation. They are in a bad situation. So the Mar-a-Lago Accord, which was named after a Florida resort that Donald Trump owns, or I'm calling it Zhongnanhai Accord. Zhongnanhai is their Rashtrapati Bhavan, which is where Xi Jinping lives and works, etc. Whatever you call it, whether it is written, it's publicly, officially announced or not, at some version of this will have to happen because the Chinese trade surplus is just too large for the rest of the world to absorb. But again, the caveat there is the short term, they may make it worse before it becomes better. But the only way out of this is for some appreciation of the Chinese currency, which interestingly will mean a big Chinese potential stock market bubble also. It could mean, for example, let's not say will mean, could mean, because China में already inflation बहुत low है. In fact, some numbers show they're in deflation. So generally, जब एक currency appreciate करती है, तो inflation कम होना चाहिए उधर, because whatever they were importing becomes cheaper. Whatever they were exporting, they can export less, so they have more capacity lying idle. So if China now appreciates its currency out of pressure, out of own choice, or a combination of both, they will have to involve massive fiscal and monetary stimulus along with it. Zero interest rates almost, QE of another scale, the way the Japanese did in the 90s and early part of the century.
QE क्या है?
Quantitative easing, just buying their own bonds.
Okay.
So the central bank is buying your own government bonds. It's like a way of pumping money in the economy, right? You basically print money. More likely you create money on computers and you just pump it into the economy, right? So the Chinese doing that will mean Chinese consumption finally happening, but the Chinese assets will also re-rate. The Chinese GDP in dollar terms will look bigger than it looks today. That will also not be very good news for Donald Trump, but he would rather choose that than this. So it's a very interesting time, therefore, to observe all of this. And the Plaza Accord, therefore, is applicable for today, but in a very modified situation. The Chinese, as I said, are very wary of doing something very similar because they don't want to get a short-term financial boost to get long-term economically uncompetitive. But again, the detail there is that the Japanese are not supposed to appreciate the currency by the extent they did in the late 80s. That was not what is written in the Plaza Accord. Once it happened, things kind of took on its own life. And when you do it for the first time, you don't have any precedent in history to look for. So the Chinese will not go to 5 to the dollar, right? And not anytime soon. If they do an appreciation, whether they announce it or not, it will be a relatively limited appreciation, maybe in the beginning. So some version of Plaza Accord is very relevant for today. It may take 2 months, 3 months, 6 months. It may become worse before it happens. It may not be to that extent. It may not be for the same reasons or the same leverage. But without that, the global trading architecture does not become remotely in harmony or equilibrium. It's never fully in equilibrium, but right now it is completely out of whack. So this kind of trade surplus, like the Indians had to again put anti-dumping duties on Chinese steel, effectively Chinese steel. China has more than half of global steel capacity, half of global cement capacity. In many cases, half or more than half in many capacities. It's just for a population that's 1/6 of the world, That is no longer sustainable. If you want that kind of capacity, you'll have to shut down some of it and you'll have to appreciate your currency so that you can consume more of that at home. Basically, if you're already rich in industrial terms, but you don't want to show it because you want to like spend more time adding more capacity, which can work when you're small, it cannot work at this scale. So, which is why I feel the Plaza Accord in some way or form will happen this year potentially, but for completely different pressure point reasons and maybe to a lesser extent and maybe not officially announced.
एंड इसमें आपने बताया कि जैसे करेंसी अप्रिशिएट होगा तो वो कंट्री का इन्फ्लेशन रेट विल
कम हो जाता है ना, अदर थिंग्स इक्वल. फॉर एग्जांपल इंडिया इंपोर्ट्स ऑयल. अगर आज रुपी 86 से 76 चला जाए and for the same price of dollar price in barrel terms, you'll have to spend less in rupee terms to import oil.
Yeah.
So generally speaking, again,
तो नहीं, हाँ, तो spend less, तो basically इससे inflation मतलब कम कैसे होगा?
in our case,
import prices कम हो गए इसीलिए.
तो आपका पेट्रोल पंप में दाम कम होना चाहिए. In our case, what happens is when the oil prices go down, the central and state governments end up increasing the taxes for the last few years. So the sticker prices remained at around 100 rupees to the litre for petrol, because that indirect tax has been useful for state and union governments. But let's say other things that we import, right? An iPhone becomes cheaper. And if an iPhone sells for $1,000, then instead of 85,000 rupees, you pay 75,000 rupees. You can add taxes, tariffs, whatever, but it will get cheaper by that much. Similarly, on the export side, a more nuanced point, your capacity, you have more free capacity because you can't export to that level. And generally, free capacity leads to some price pressures reducing. You have more spare capacity, you have more idle capacity. So for China to appreciate its currency when it already is close to deflation, it will really have to do a big stimulus. अभी तक थोड़ा बहुत फिस्कल किया था, सितंबर में किया था after the first 50 basis point cut of Fed last year by Jay Powell. This time they'll really have to do a fiscal and monetary stimulus, go to almost zero interest rates, do QE. हम QE को इंडिया में OMO बोलते हैं, open market operation. It's effectively the same thing. RBI buying bonds. Basically, they'll have to pump in a lot of money, which will effectively pump up the stock market, because this time they're very clear they don't want to pump up the real estate market. So what else is there left to pump? But they're anyways buying and importing more gold than earlier. So, which is why I was saying the 20-year ka jo correlation या lack of correlation था between Chinese growth and stock market, that lack of correlation may not necessarily hold going forward. Going forward, the growth may slow down economically, but the markets may boom. So once you understand the deeper reasons, and assuming your thesis is correct, and there is an element of luck in the timing involved, then what seems absurd becomes less absurd. Ki last 20 years, GDP growth was high, markets were terrible in China. Maybe the next 10 years, GDP growth is much lower because you remember you are exporting less with a higher currency now, but the markets do much better. So it is what it is.
If you learned something new from this video, do share it with your friends and subscribe to this channel so that we can bring you the best content possible. Also, if you want to watch this entire episode, click on the link in the description box and you can go to Kushal Lodha YouTube channel and watch the entire podcast episode. Thank you so much for watching this and have an amazing day.